slightly delayed, but highly anticipated 2019 lecture, Elske VP Smith lecture. And Dr. Robert Godwin Jones will be presenting that. I'm just going to, my name is Sally Honeycutt, and I'm just going to introduce the lecture. First, just wanted to share with you a little bit about who Elske VP Smith is. This lectureship was established in honor of her career, particularly at VCU. She was at VCU as the Dean of Humanities and Sciences from 1980 to 1992. And she was had a long career in astronomy. And in an interview she gave a few years ago, she said that she started out with a love of chemistry, but took an astronomy class and then kind of switched into astronomy. So her career as a scientist was focused in that field. She had a career in research. She was active in teaching in the general science curriculum at University of Maryland, and then moved into administration when she came to Virginia Commonwealth University when we were still a very young university in 1980. And we're very excited that to have this lecture given every year in her honor. And as I said, this year, our lecturer is Robert Godwin Jones from the School of World Studies. Just a few things about his background. He said he was attracted to VCU because he wanted to combine his degree in comparative literature. So he has a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in comparative literature. With his interest also in French and German. So he had his undergraduate bachelor's degree from Franklin and Marshall College in French and German. He also got very involved in technology and media for teaching early on. And if any of you were here in VCU in the late 90s, early 2000s, you'll remember Web Course in a Box, which eventually was purchased by and became the core of Blackboard. And he's still active in this area. He's recently garnered grants to create a digital archive of Grimm's fairy tales. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over to Dr. Godwin Jones, who will present his lecture. So let's welcome Dr. Godwin Jones.
Thanks, Sally. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Get that started. I assume you're all seeing the presentation, PowerPoint?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, great. So topic for this talk is language learning today. Where is technology leading us? And I'm going to be talking initially about where we are in terms of language study today in the United States, what technology can offer us for language learning, what the opportunities are, as well as the challenges. I'll be talking about what's available online in terms of informal language learning and how that can be combined with formal instruction. I want to start with some assumptions that underlie what I'll be saying today. One is that from my perspective, language learning is more important today than it's ever been. And one of the reasons for that is that language is not just a linguistic tool, but a social tool. It's closely tied to culture and society. And I'll talk about that in a minute, a little bit more. And I also am working on the assumption that language learning today and language instruction today should always integrate technology to one extent or another, that it's not something that we can ignore. I'm assuming as well that the tools and services out there that are available for working with languages will continue to evolve and continue to advance, and I'll talk about those today. But at the same time, I'm going to be concluding with this model of language learning that very much includes the human factor, the teaching presence. And I would maintain that for most contexts and for most learners, that model of blended learning is really optimal. So where are we with language learning today? Well, unfortunately, it's on the decline in the United States pretty broadly, both in K-12 and higher ed. We're seeing a lot of programs closed down, language programs closed down, majors, including in Virginia. I think part of that is kind of the general decline in liberal arts with more and more interest in fields and majors that seem like they will feed directly into employment opportunities. So we're seeing a lot more interest in STEM fields, computer programming. You may be aware of the fact that this past year, the General Assembly voted to have computer programming substitute for foreign language study in Virginia for the academic pre-college prep diploma. And that's, I think, nothing that's new. U.S. has traditionally been a monolingual society. It's kind of part of that big country syndrome that you see to a certain extent also in China and Russia, where there's seems to be little need or little interest in learning another language. We also have a political situation that fosters the growth of isolationism. That's not helpful for language learning. And I would argue that the pandemic has accelerated that trend towards turning inward and away from contact with others, including contact with cultural others. At the same time, I'm going to end with a certain degree of optimism that the current situation poses a lot of challenges, but maybe an opportunity to do something new and different and improved in terms of language learning and language instruction. The talk is based on two articles I published recently, one specifically tied to this topic of devices, smart devices, and what that offers us in terms of language learning. And the other just published this month on a proposed model for blended language learning. So I'm going to start, however, by talking about how I got involved with language learning and technology, and I'll explain what this statue of Mao Zedong is doing there. That's, by the way, a statue that you see on the entrance to Fudan University campus in Shanghai. As Sally mentioned, I've had an early interest actually in technology as applied to language learning, and that was through various opportunities in grad school when I was a graduate teaching assistant, opportunities for integrating technology into my classes. We had at the University of Illinois, we had a language lab. It's reel-to-reel format, which was what was available at that time. We even had a distance learning component where students can call up on the telephone and have access to texts in various languages that were read over the telephone to them. Also, at that time, University of Illinois was the main innovator in what was called at that time program learning through the Plato project that you may or may not have heard of. This involved using a mainframe computer with terminals for delivering complementary instruction to regular classes in a variety of disciplines. And one of those areas where there was a lot of work being done at the University of Illinois was actually in languages and foreign language instruction. My office mate actually was one of the programmers for Plato at that time. So I started to get a sense of what was available. This was also a time when video was starting to become popular, was starting to be available together with textbooks. This was obviously not digital video, this was analog, but you could see the benefits of having that exposure outside of the classroom to authentic language. And certainly that has been the sustaining interest for me in using technology, is making available to students more input in the language that they're learning, to provide voices that complement what they hear in the classroom and what they get from the textbook. When I came to VCU in the late 70s, I remember that at one of the first faculty meetings that I attended, I asked the chair of the department, foreign languages, who was Bill Beck, said, Bill, maybe we'd look at the possibility of getting a language lab. There had been an old reel-to-reel language lab that was no longer being used. And Bill said, Bob, you must not follow developments in language pedagogy because language labs are outmoded. Well, it seemed to me that there were still lots of advantages to having that opportunity for students to hear the language outside of the classroom, because in the class they get just limited access to hearing the language, and so that's the big advantage today of the internet, the opportunities that are there. So eventually we did get a language lab, and that was through the HETF funding in the late 80s. And I became the first lab director. I think that was in 1990, did that for a few years, and then became chair of the foreign language department. And just at that time, we had a new dean coming in who replaced Elske, whom Sally was talking about. And this was David Hiley. And one of the first conversations I had with David, he asked me, what is your department doing with computers? And I said, well, we're doing quite a bit. We have Windows 3.1 and WordPerfect. Colleagues are starting to type their own papers and no longer giving them to the secretary as handwritten manuscripts to type up. He said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. He said, how are you using computers in language learning? And I said, well, I think some of us are printing up handouts. He said, no, you need to do better than that. He said, he was coming from Auburn University, and they had been on the forefront of actually developing software for language learning. And so he wanted me to look into what was available. And so I did some research and discovered that things had advanced quite a bit from the Plato days, that now with personal computers, there was a lot that you could do with language learning. And in particular, I discovered that a lot of language departments in the US and elsewhere were using Macintosh computers. I had never seen a Macintosh computer. I wasn't familiar with it at all. But as I looked into it, I saw that there were advantages there. One of the main ones that that Macs supported had built-in support for audio playback. And now at that time, if you had a Windows computer, you had to actually install a soundboard, and then you had to configure it. So it was not an easy process. But it was not just the audio that Macs had. In the early 90s, as I was looking at this, there was also digital video. And even though it was very small, the QuickTime at that time available on Macs, very small video window and jerky playback, but you could see already the potential there with digital audio and digital media. Digital video. And so I decided to write a grant to get a computer lab, a Mac lab, and I got that grant. And so we had money to put together our first computer lab on the 4th floor of Hibbs. And the following year, I wrote a second grant and got additional computers, and discovered that, well, that was great to have the computers, but we didn't have anybody in the department with interest or expertise in using computers for language learning. So it kind of fell on me to look at what was available and to start kind of prototyping possible software. So I developed some HyperCard programs, HyperCard stacks as they were called, for language learning in German. And then some colleagues also developed in HyperCard as well. And so this was kind of my entrance into being actively involved in language learning and technology. And how's that connected with Mao Zedong? Well, a few years later, I was in charge of the language programs when the Department of Foreign Languages was integrated into the new School of World Studies. And we were looking at how to improve instruction, particularly in Chinese. There was a lot of interest. There continues to be a lot of interest in Chinese. And we had at that time and still have a relationship with Fudan University in Shanghai. And we were able to do a faculty exchange where we had a BCU faculty member, Ron Corio, from the English language program, who went over and taught English in Shanghai. And we brought then an instructor from the Chinese department, Chinese language and literature department at Fudan, brought over to teach Chinese. And we set up a intensive Chinese class that had combined two semesters into one. And so there was 2 hours, 5 days a week, quite an intensive program. And so that fall, I believe it was 2006 or 2007, Jian Yong from Fudan was over, and I remember standing out in the outside in the hallway outside of the language lab just when the semester started. We were waiting for a workshop to start, and Jiang pointed to the plaque. He said, "Oh, that's your name. That's you. That's quite impressive." And the plaque was there because one of my wonderful colleagues, Peter Kirkpatrick, had the idea that somehow I should be recognized for getting the funding for the lab and setting it up initially, because I did initially the networking and the software installation. So there was a plaque there. It's still there, kind of an embarrassing thing. And, you know, I wanted to laugh off the fact that there was that plaque with my name on it. And so I said to Jiang, well, yeah, that's very nice, but, you know, VCU is planning to build a statue of me and putting it on campus. And so we laughed about that. And it turned out that later in that fall, that semester, I actually went to Shanghai. My oldest son married a young woman, Chinese woman from Shanghai. And so we went over to visit his family. And I thought, well, I'll stop by Fudan and visit the department and talk about how things are going. And I assumed that Jiang had probably told them a little bit about his experiences at VCU. And that was very helpful in meeting folks there. And they took me out, the chair of the Chinese department there at Fudan, took me and other faculty members from Fudan, from the department, out for lunch. And one of the first things that the chair said to me as we sat down, that it's such a great honor to have such an important person come to visit us. And I said, "What? I'm not that important a person." And she said, "Oh yes, you must be if they're building a statue to you." And just a demonstration of the fact that I'm going to be talking about today, that language is a tricky thing, and humor, for example, doesn't always carry across languages and cultures. So I had this idea in my mind of something like Mao Zedong there at the entrance to VCU, but me instead of Mao. It's a very strange idea. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about 3 different scenarios for language learning and where language learning is going today, and where technology is leading us, because that's the main topic. So the first scenario is there's no need these days to learn another language because we have devices, we have Google Translate, and we have devices, dedicated devices that will do the translating and interpreting for us. Second scenario is there's so much online in terms of resources, in terms of text, but also in particular videos in other languages, that you can teach yourself another language just by using those resources. So that's the second scenario. The third scenario is what I wrote about in that article that I mentioned previously, that to me, the optimal environment for most learners is going to be a combination of using those informal resources and those smart tools with a overt instruction. In other words, with a class, a language class. I'll be talking about that at the end of the talk today. So here's the first scenario. Language instructors may someday be replaced by multilingual versions of Siri on your iPhone. Well, meanwhile, we do have multilingual versions of Siri, and not only of Siri, we have lingual versions of competing products, these intelligent language assistants like Google Assistant, like Alexa from Amazon. And those are the US competitors. There are Chinese equivalents from Alibaba and Baidu. And these are being continually developing. They're improving all the time in their capabilities. That's true for Google Translate as well. And in particular, we're looking at this interest and competition among these companies in promoting the so-called Internet of Things. So we already have wearable versions of these smart assistants. It's not just on our mobile phone, but is available on devices like Apple Watch. Siri is available on that. You have Google Assistant available on earbuds. You have those assistants available on devices in the home. You have smart speakers. Amazon even has a smart smart clock. Some of these assistants are being built into, of all things, doorbells. So you're seeing this Internet of Things where you have that multilingual capability, and I'm going to be talking about that more specifically and showing you how that works. These developments are enabled through two basic areas of development. One is big data. That is to say, collection of languages. Google in particular has been doing this, creating language corpora, as they're called, where you have collections of language that are analyzed and can be both written and spoken text, analyzed and tagged, and then available for artificial intelligence to analyze and figure out how the language works. And so, for example, for Google Translate, they started off having a model of language, the rules of how a language works, how English works. For example, the fact that typically the word order is subject, verb, object. Other languages have different typical orders in sentences. That's just one example. But these days, Google Translate works more with statistical machine learning. That is to say that it's based on these huge collections of dual language corpora. And so that's the first thing that's looked for. Are there phrases or patterns that are available in that data set that can be used to do the translation? If not, then Google Translate falls back on the language model that's also built in. So this has enabled this artificial intelligence that is able to deal with translation, is based on advances in things like neural networks that permit this so-called deep machine learning, where you have multiple layers of neural networks that work through the problem and provide a solution in terms of coming up with coming up with a translation. The other thing we're seeing along those lines are advances in natural language processing, and in particular in speech recognition and voice synthesis. And I'm going to show you an example of what that has enabled these services and devices to do. In fact, there are a number now of products that are available that, for example, this one from Waverly Labs, the Ambassador, products that, in this case, it markets itself as a wearable interpreter. So it features 20 different languages. This is an over-the-ear device. And you can speak into it in English and will spit out then one of 20 languages that are available. You also have this kind of thing coming, and I'm sure there are more of these smart glasses on the way. This one supports Alexa. And all of these, the earbuds, the glasses, they have typically a companion mobile app that provides some additional functionality. So we're seeing more and more of those kinds of things, and we seem to be moving towards this vision of a world where language learning is no longer really necessary, because you have the ability to instantly have your whatever you want to say be made understandable through machine translation and machine interpretation. So the vision is what is familiar to you if you've watched Star Trek, and I'm going to play this clip.
What are you? I'm human. My name is Michael. I come from a planet called Earth. And I work with your brother on the Starship Discovery.
How is it that we can understand one another?
This device, it's able to translate over 1,000 languages.
It's indeed an amazing device because it can deal with earthbound languages, but alien languages as well, and seems to also avoid the problem of lip syncing there. So obviously something that's very impressive, but how close are we to that vision of having this universal translator? Well, there are actually devices out there that these pocket translators or pocket interpreters that market themselves as at least a preliminary version of the universal translator. And this is one of those. This is called Smart Talk. And I'll play this clip for you.
So this is the Pocket Talk. Now I am headed to China soon. I'm very excited about this. I do not speak a word of Chinese. Okay, I do not speak a word of Chinese. I do not understand a word of Chinese, but this is the universal translator. This is like something out of Star Trek. Apparently, I hold this up to taxi drivers in China and they will not take me to the wrong place. Yeah, so Rich, you guys were showing this off originally months ago, but now you're much closer to actually releasing it, right?
That's right. So we debuted it in the States at CES in Vegas, and now we are just a couple of months away. We'll be out in market in September.
Okay. So now how many languages does this translate between?
This translates 63 languages.
Wow.
So, and that's two-way, and most of those are full audio. There's a few that are audio to text, but yeah, for most of the languages you're going to learn, it is, any language in, any language out.
Now, where are you getting all this language data from? Is this just basically Google Translate in a box?
That's a really good question. Because we're kind of the translation agnostic platform, we are actually using a bunch of different translations. So we are using some of Google Translate. We're using some from partners like Baidu. Really, whoever is doing the best translation in a given language, that's the one we're going to put on the platform.
That's one of the products that's available. One of the other interesting ones, whoops, let me move on to the second one. One of the other interesting ones shows actually how such a product would be used in real exchanges. Play that for you.
So we're in Tokyo! I can't understand any of this. Okay, so what do we do? Excuse me. I don't know how to buy this ticket. Yeah. We want to go to Shinba. Yeah, Shinba. Can you help us? Akasaka Excel Hotel. I want to stay at a room with a nice view. 眺めのいい部屋ですね。Crazy night. Hey ya! Asakusa! 3, 2, 1. I want to find a good-looking guy.
So this is obviously pre-pandemic, these videos. Really interesting, I think, you know, how these are marketed and what they're capable of doing. So I'm going to do a little reality check here. Well, one of the things that you notice right away is that you have to hold up the device and let it translate for you. So it's not a real natural kind of conversation that you're having. You have a technical intermediary there that's helping you to communicate. There are practical issues with these devices in terms of having to be connected to either a Wi-Fi network or have a cell phone plan. But I think one of the main issue is that these are programmed to deal with specific situations that are transactional. In other words, language used in specific contexts. So things like checking into a hotel or buying a ticket, where you can anticipate, where the software can anticipate what are the typical items of vocabulary, what are the typical phrases will be used. And so that can be built into the device and so handle that kind of transactional language situation quite well. But as you can see, you're basically, the user is on the outside here. You're not really communicating. You're not having a human conversation with the people that you're meeting using this device. So obviously for touristic purposes, there's a role to play, but in terms of having real exchanges with folks, these devices are not going to really fit the bill. At the same time, we're seeing really interesting developments in terms of voice technology. And I wanted to play for you an example of what we're seeing, for example, from Google. Google has this add-on to Google Assistant called Google Duplex that allows Google Assistant to call up a restaurant for you and make a reservation. So I'm going to play a clip there, and then I'll talk about that. What you hear, the first voice is the person at the restaurant answering the phone call.
Hello, Barcelona, I'm here.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi, I'm calling to make a reservation. I'm Google's automated booking service, so I'll record the call. Could I book a table for Tuesday the 21st?
Okay, hello?
I'd like to make a reservation for a client. It's for Tuesday the 21st.
Okay. Actually, how many people?
It's for 10 people.
10 people? Okay, what time?
At 7 p.m.
7 p.m., okay.
I need a table for 7 p.m.
Okay, 7 p.m., okay. And then,
Yeah.
Is there any kids?
I'm actually booking on behalf of a client, so I'm not too sure.
Not too sure? Okay, got it. Okay, so please be on time at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I can put you in the reservation book. So see you on Tuesday.
Oh, would you like the client's name now?
Yes.
The first name is Cade.
Okay, Kate. Okay, what is the last name?
Last name Metz.
Matt. Okay, what is the telephone number?
You probably noticed how natural that synthetic voice sounds, very human-like, and that comes through the colloquial tone that's used there, as well as the fillers, yeah. So very colloquial language. The intonation sounds completely natural. There are some kind of repetitions that are a little bit awkward, but in general, the language can pass for human in terms of how it sounds. And we're seeing that develop more and more, not only through Google, but other voice services from Apple and from Amazon as well. Now, obviously, what's going on here is that the software is looking for specific items that in the conversation. So looking for things like what time or how many in your party. And so it's much easier to develop a response to those if you can anticipate what the situation is, because there's a limited domain there in terms of vocabulary and frequent kinds of questions, phrases that will be used. And so Google Duplex at this point is fairly limited. It is expanded this year to not just making dinner reservations, but also to reserve a rental car. So, I think we're going to see more and more of that, and I assume the domains will expand as well.
Hello, boss.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next.
Hello?
Whoops. So we're going to see more of that, and we're going to see more of those that voice capabilities in more devices. Well, this is very nice, but at the same time, it raises questions, it seems to me, that have arisen already in terms of AI technology in so-called deep fakes that you've heard about recently, where you have pictures in social media of somebody posting on Facebook, and it turns out the face that's being shown isn't a real person, it's an AI creation. Well, you have that same potential for fakery, their auditory fakery, through developments in voice synthesis. So that certainly is cause for concern, seems to me. So we'll see improvements, and improvements in the past few years have been dramatic in terms of language processing and voice synthesis. But I think that we'll never get to the point where speech will be completely natural sounding from AI. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that speech is difficult, human speech. We have standard language, but we have lots of language use that's non-standard. And that comes from, for example, dialects, regional differences, country differences, but also individual ways of speaking. You have idiomatic uses, non-literal uses of language. Some of those can be built into the database, some of them perhaps not. You have learner language, which is unpredictable, full of mistakes. And so you want a system to be able to figure out all those variations that might come its way in terms of language. One of the main things that's problematic is the fact that you don't get the nonverbal cues that sometimes will, in fact, the facial expression may override the verbal message. And particularly problematic is when you have things like sarcasm or humor, as I was talking about earlier, or irony, that we can figure out what's going on, because humans can detect those tones and use what they know about the social context or know about the context of the conversation, and and we live in the real world, and computers don't. So we know how what is involved in conversations, and it's a lot more than just words. It's a lot more than just verbal language. And one of those things that's involved is the cultural aspect of language. So, for example, one of the differences between languages is how language is used to get things done, what are called speech acts in sociolinguistics or the field of pragmatics. So, for example, to make requests in English, we tend to use softeners like "Would you please pass me the salt? Could you do this for me?" Other languages don't do that. Chinese tends to be much more direct in those situations, and other languages as well. And so that cultural aspect of language would need to be programmed in as well. That's a little bit tricky. And finally, you have the fact that more and more, and this is especially something that you see online, a lot of code switching of mixing languages within one conversation or even within one sentence. And so the AI would have to be able to detect not only the main language, but other languages as well. So there's a lot that would have that the computer would have to figure out there. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about the second scenario that I mentioned earlier, namely that given all the resources that are available online, you don't really need to go to enroll in a language class. You can do that all yourself online, independently, autonomously. And there have been a number of studies in recent years that have shown that there are lots of folks actually doing that. You may have seen some of these have been in the news. For example, folks learning English by watching over and over again episodes of Friends or Seinfeld. Although it does seem that some of the humor there in those shows would be a little bit difficult to carry over into other languages and other cultures. But this is basically folks who are combining interest maybe in improving their English or other language with entertainment. And one of the main players here is Netflix. Netflix is available in 190 countries now. And one of the great things about Netflix for language learning is obviously you have entertaining content, and that's great because you want to have as much contact with the language, the target language, as possible. So if you feel the content is compelling, you're going to watch it over and over again, and so that's great in terms of language learning. But the other thing is that there are subtitles available in multiple languages, and so that provides really useful scaffolding in terms of turning on and off, switching on and off the subtitles to test your understanding. Watch it a first time with subtitles, watch it a second time with subtitles in the target language, and watch it a third time without subtitles at all. So it's a great way to work with language. And these studies have shown that folks doing this for improving their language skills, particularly in English, have improved in what one would expect to happen, namely in vocabulary development, listening skills, but also productive skills, in other words, in speaking ability as well. So this is based on kind of a different approach to language than we're used to, this idea that language is really pattern-based. It's based on repeating frequent patterns and not on rules of grammar. That's typically how languages have been taught, kind of starting with the grammar and vocabulary and moving on from that. And increasingly, linguists have found that really what is useful is to view language as a set of multi-word phrases that are repeated over and over again, and that the frequency of those phrases is what the frequently used phrases are what you want learners to absorb and acquire to be able to use the language fluently. And this is where something like watching movies comes into play. And what's been shown is particularly useful are watching things like soap operas or situation comedies, because you have the same characters from episode to episode using similar language in slightly different contexts. So you get repetition, but repetition with variation. And so that's shown to be a very effective language learning strategy. And that's not just video, watching videos. You have streaming services, audio, working with popular music. For example, the lyrics are available online. There've been a lot of studies that have looked at young adults who are doing that and particularly learning English that way. So there's a lot of interest in that right now in second language acquisition in that field. There are a few caveats there I would point out. One is that most of these studies focus on English for understandable reasons, and most of the content there comes from American or British producers and is originally in English, although a lot of it is available in other languages as well. Netflix has programming from all over the world. Most of those studies also target not beginners, but intermediate and advanced learners, and who already have a basic knowledge of the language and are gaining proficiency in what they already have, building on what the foundation that they've had, typically through a class experience. The other thing that's important, I think, to recognize is that not everybody's going to have access to these resources, particularly Netflix. Netflix you have to pay for. And the digital divide is real, not just between countries, between cultures, but we've seen through the pandemic that digital divide is very real here in the United States, in Central Virginia, where you have families that are having difficulty getting access to their online classes because they don't have the devices or they don't have the internet connectivity. I would just mention very briefly that in addition to these informal resources, some of which are commercial, some of which are free, like YouTube is one that's been studied a lot in terms of its potential for language learning. There are also these paying services, and those have seen a big uptick recently in popularity during the pandemic. This is one of the things that folks have discovered they can do at home, is work on learning a second language. And I don't have time to talk about those in any detail. They're very interesting. Some of them have improved significantly in terms of their approach to language learning. They started off kind of offering kind of mechanical drill and practice kinds of exercises, but lately they have integrated things like conversations with peers or conversations with expert speakers of the language. So they certainly are very interesting, but typically you get a free come-ons with those, but eventually you have to pay for the service. So I'm going to move on to this final scenario that I'm advocating as the ideal format in most contexts for most learners. One of the issues with learning online and doing that kind of autonomously and independently, not being enrolled in a informal language learning class, is that there are so many things out there that you can use that it's kind of hard sometimes to know where to start. And so the whole process can be inefficient. That's one of the advantages of having a classroom experience. Obviously, you're guided towards where the resources are and what makes sense to learn. There's obviously, if you're working independently using those online resources, there's no mentor there typically for you. You might have a Facebook group that you're involved in that could help you out and make suggestions. There are other kinds of communities, online communities that might be helpful to you. But you typically are not going to get as much assistance as you would if you're actually enrolled in a class where you have an instructor available to you. So what I'm advocating there, and what I try to use even before the pandemic, what I've tried to use to the extent possible in teaching my classes is this blended learning format where you have a combination of in-class teaching combined with work outside the classroom and basically relying on online resources. And this is particularly helpful at the beginning level where you really need both the structure and the encouragement. Language learning can be a stressful process. It's kind of an invasive process in a way because it's taking away typically what you rely on for emotional support, your language, right? Your first language. And so having that support and mentoring and motivation from a teacher can be really crucially important, particularly at the beginning stages of learning a second language. There's also an advantage in instructed learning environments for more advanced learners. I was talking about how you can pick up patterns by watching videos, for example, or listening to music, but you're not necessarily picking up the subtleties of the second language. You're exposed to what's frequently used, and you may not have exposure to all the intricacies of using things like subjunctive forms for making requests. Some of that you'll probably be exposed to, some of it not. So in terms of building accuracy, grammatical correctness in your use of the language, that's where the instruction can be very helpful. So not just at the beginning levels, but at the more advanced levels as well. And one of the things that I think we've seen increasingly, including at VCU, that can be very helpful in language learning is setting up a structure where you have regular class meetings, but you also have things like virtual exchange or telecollaboration. This is something that we've been using at VCU for some time, where we set up a class exchange and use what is referred to as tandem learning. So you might have a class at VCU, Spanish class, hook up with a class in Mexico of learners of English. And so you get together and do video conferencing in Skype or Zoom, whatever platform is available. And you meet for maybe half an hour at a time, maybe once a week, something like that. And for half that time, you speak in Spanish, and half that time you speak in English. And this is proven to be very effective, both in terms of language learning, in terms of motivation, but also in terms of cultural learning. And because there you have a real intercultural experience, because you're meeting with and talking with and exchanging views with people from a different culture. So I'm going to end with talking about what I see as new opportunities for language learning in this time of disruption in society and disruption in teaching and learning. We have this situation where we have all been thrust into suddenly being asked as instructors, do you want to teach your class synchronously or asynchronously? And folks who never had any exposure to online teaching are suddenly been thrust into that. And so I think we've all been discovering the benefits of online learning, how to use Zoom, for example, but also the problems. And there are various problems, obviously, that arise, but one of those is that you don't have that person-to-person contact that you have in a blended learning environment, or you have in a regular face-to-face class. One of the other things that we're learning is how difficult it is for some folks to learn online, that there are cultural issues, there are practical issues. And another side of that is that, we're seeing such social upheaval in the United States and elsewhere. And those kinds of things creep into language learning inevitably, because language reflects culture and society. And so, as I mentioned earlier, of all the disciplines, I think that all the kinds of areas of instruction that we offer in higher ed at VCU, the one that is most effective, I think, and offers the greatest opportunities for intercultural understanding and learning about intercultural communication has to be foreign languages, because they're, particularly if you engage in this virtual exchange of telecollaboration that I was mentioning earlier, it really provides the real experiences in using that social tool of language and working through differences, not just linguistic differences, but cultural and social differences as well. So the model that I'm advocating for, and this not just in the time where we have to engage in distance learning, but I think moving forward, is that we need to take advantage of the tools that are available through technology for language learning. And that includes informal online resources that make sense for whatever level of language you're teaching, and for whichever course, language course or cultural literature course. I think we can't ignore the technology resources that are there. And those may very well include things like Google Translate. I know some colleagues have said, said to students, don't use Google Translate. Well, I think that's the wrong approach. I think we have to show students how to use those tools, how to use Google Translate. What is Google Translate good at? For example, translating words or translating phrases. What can it not do so well? Well, it can't do a whole page of text very well. It can't deal very well with colloquial or idiomatic language. And I think that's the kind of thing I think that's important to talk about in a language class, rather than saying to students, don't use Google Translate. I think we have to, students are going to be using it anyway, even if we say you can't. And I think the same is true for other tools, other of these smart tools. I think we have to see to what extent they can be used in instruction. For example, smart speakers that are now quite popular. Those can be used to practice pronunciation. So one of the things that you can do with those devices is you can set the language to a different language rather than the default of English, and see if when you ask a question, is it understood or not? In other words, is your pronunciation intelligible to the device? And so that's one of the things that you could do with those smart tools. At the same time, as I said before, I think teachers are really important part of that process, and language learning maybe more so than in other disciplines, because of the emotional aspect of language learning. It's not just a cognitive process. And I think, one of the things that's really important, and it's harder to do when you're teaching online or totally online. One of the things that's really important is to the extent possible in language learning, I think there too, more so maybe than in other disciplines, to personalize learning. I think one of the things that we've always assumed in teaching languages is that, kind of one size fits all, and that students are all, going to need the 4 skills equally. So they all need to speak and be able to listen and read and write. Well, it could be, and I think increasingly we're seeing that, is that some students maybe don't need all those 4 skills if they are really interested in language, but maybe for specific purposes. I know that I started trying to learn Russian because I love Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and wanted to try to read them in the original, which turned out to be much more difficult than I anticipated. But I was not so interested in learning to speak, but really learning how to read. One of the things that we've started working on, and this is through the wonderful guidance of Catherine Murphy-Judy in French at VCU, is engaging what are sometimes called bridging activities that bridge between formal instruction and informal online resources. And so at the intermediate level, we're asking students to engage in what we're calling a curation project, where the students go out and find resources for languages, for language learning that, first of all, are in the target language, but second of all, have content that the student himself or herself might find of interest, either of personal interest, because it meshes up with that student's interest in music or art or whatever hobby the student might have, or meshes with what the student might think he or she might do after graduation. So there can be a tie-in to the major that the student is pursuing at VCU, or other professional interests. And that makes language learning more personable, customizable, and motivates the students much more. And so that's something that I think makes sense to, as a model of blended learning, to the extent that it's possible, is bring in that capability of students being able to follow their own interests. And as I said earlier, I think that, you know, this expanded model of blended learning that I'm advocating is not just adding technology and the affordances, the opportunities that technology offers, but also talking about social concerns. You know, when we teach language, we inevitably talk about another culture that always comes into play. And I think when you do that, you're obviously talking about kind of surface level culture to some extent. So what do they eat over there? You know, what's the school system like? But you also, I think, have an opportunity to go deeper and talk about, well, how does that society deal with minorities, for example? So, you know, we have the opportunity there. And I think it makes a lot of sense these days to think about integrating social justice themes to the extent that that's possible. That's another area where a textbook is probably not going to be the vehicle for allowing you to do that. That's where online resources are going to come into play as well, because those social concerns are not usually anything that's included in standard language textbooks. And I think I'll end on that note. And if you have questions, I'd be glad to address those, or try to.
Oh, thank you, Bob, for a really stimulating talk. I got some wonderful ideas there. Really like this idea of a virtual exchange, and thought that might be exciting to do in a science classroom as much as in a language classroom. If anyone in the audience has any questions or comments they'd like to share, please post those to the Q&A. We're seeing a few comments in the chat come up as well. Yep. So Mark Wood asks, he says, thank you, Bob. Many times when we talk about endangered languages and like indigenous languages, the loss is not just about the language, but cultural ideas embedded in those languages. And how might virtual language learning address this concern?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic, because on the one hand, technology offers a lot of support for example, recording speakers in those endangered languages, and then building up a dictionary of languages and having that language documented. I mean, that's one of the advantages of technology. On the other hand, you know, technology spreads English all over the place and tends to then discourage learning of indigenous languages. And so it's really a mixed bag. Although we're seeing, I think, more and more recognition that, you know, English is an important language to learn throughout the world, you know, in terms of social, financial advancement. But at the same time, I think we're seeing a shift towards folks saying, okay, just learning English is great, but we also need to support our local languages. I think, you know, we're not seeing that universally. That's for sure. And kind of the overselling of English is problematic, I think, in some parts of the world. But I think, you know, technology can help in terms of both documenting a indigenous language, and one of the other things we're seeing is that you have communities of learners of those languages that are spread throughout the world. And obviously, with the internet, you can bring those communities together, and that's one way to support those less often used languages or indigenous languages, is that you have online communities that will support further use and development of the language, and create resources for learning the language online, which is really great.
Thank you. And for some reason that was showing up, I just wanted to acknowledge that was Isabel's question. Any other questions? I'll just also say that I really appreciate the how it's still important that we have the instructor and the community of learners that are coming together, and even in space, in the same space whenever possible, but still using the best of technology to support learning, right? So not avoiding the technology, but really still how we need each other to learn.
Yeah, and I think that social aspect of learning has become so evident in language learning, and so much a part of that field of second language acquisition. We used to think that language learning was just mostly a cognitive process, but obviously as a social tool, you know, you have to work with people. And so I think that's one of the big advantages of the internet, is that community of interest that you can build, and use the target language for that.
Okay, I think that this is from Kathy Murphy-Judy. Some of your ideas fit really well with make it real. And can you talk about that?
Oh, that's interesting. I think that's exactly right, Catherine. I think that fits exactly into, at least as I understand it, you know, what we're trying to do there, because, you know, language is a real skill. And one of the things we're trying to promote in the language program at VCU is adding that skill to your resume. So it's something that companies are looking for, both in terms of language skills, right? People who can handle other languages, but also people who are flexible, right, in their worldview, who deal well with diverse others, right? And that intercultural, multicultural aspect is something that you get through language learning. You get a new view of the world. You know, you get a second you to a certain extent if you reach a certain level of proficiency in the language. And so, you know, that makes you a more flexible person. And that's what companies are looking for. And I think, you know, in terms of real skills, that's a real skill. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think on that very positive note, I'll just say thank you again. And I'm sure that our audience is applauding, although we can't hear them. And really appreciate you sharing some exciting ideas that the wheels are turning on things that we might do in the future at VCU. So excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.